Siddhartha is a 1922 novel by Hermann Hesse that deals with the spiritual journey of self-discovery of a man named Siddhartha during the time of the Gautama Buddha. The book, Hesse's ninth novel, was written in German, in a simple, lyrical style. It was published in the US in 1951 and became influential during the 1960s. Hesse dedicated Siddhartha to Romain, Rolland and Wilhelm Gundert. The word Siddhartha is made up of two words in the Sanskrit language, siddha plus artha, which together means he who has found meaning, or he who has attained his goals. In fact, the Buddha's own name, before his renunciation, was Siddhartha Gautama, Prince of Kapilvastu. In this book, the Buddha is referred to as Gautama. Plot: the story takes place in ancient India. Siddhartha, the son of a Brahmin, decides to leave behind his home in the hopes of gaining spiritual illumination by becoming an ascetic wandering beggar of the Samanas. Joined by his best friend Govinda, Siddhartha fasts, becomes homeless, renounces all personal possessions, and intensely meditates, eventually seeking and personally speaking with Gautama, the famous Buddha, or enlightened one. Afterward, both Siddhartha and Govinda acknowledge the elegance of the Buddha's teachings. Although Govinda hastily joins the Buddha's order, Siddhartha does not follow, claiming that the Buddha's philosophy, though supremely wise, does not account for the necessarily distinct experiences of each person. He argues that the individual seeks an absolutely unique and personal meaning that cannot be presented to him by a teacher. He thus resolves to carry on his quest alone. Siddhartha crosses a river and the generous ferryman, whom Siddhartha is unable to pay, merrily predicts that Siddhartha will return to the river later to compensate him in some way. Venturing onward toward city life, Siddhartha discovers Kamala, the most beautiful woman he has yet seen. Kamala, a courtesan of affluent men, notes Siddhartha's handsome appearance and fast wit, telling him that he must become wealthy to win her affections so that she may teach him the art of love. Although Siddhartha despised materialistic pursuits as a samana, he agrees now to Kamala's suggestions. She directs him to the employ of Kamaswami, a local businessman, and insists that he have Kamaswami treat him as an equal rather than an underling. Siddhartha easily succeeds, providing a voice of patience and tranquility against Kamaswami's fits of passion, which Siddhartha learned from his days as an ascetic. Thus, Siddhartha becomes a rich man and Kamala's lover, though in his middle years realizes that the luxurious lifestyle he has chosen is merely a game, empty of spiritual fulfillment. Leaving the fast-paced bustle of the city, Siddhartha returns to the river and thinks of killing himself. He is saved only by an internal experience of the holy word, Om. The very next morning Siddhartha briefly reconnects with Govinda, who is passing through the area as a wandering Buddhist. Siddhartha decides to live out the rest of his life in the presence of the spiritually inspirational river. Siddhartha thus reunites with the ferryman, named Vasudeva, with whom he begins a humbler way of life. Although Vasudeva is a simple man, he understands and relates that the river has many voices and significant messages to divulge to any who might listen. Some years later, Kamala, now a Buddhist convert, is traveling to see the Buddha at his deathbed, accompanied reluctantly by her young son, when she is bitten by a venomous snake near Siddhartha's river. Siddhartha recognizes her and realizes that the boy is his own child. After Kamala's death, Siddhartha attempts to console and raise the furiously resistant boy, until one day the child flees altogether. Although Siddhartha is desperate to find his runaway son, Vasudeva urges him to let the boy find his own path, much like Siddhartha did himself in his youth. Listening to the river with Vasudeva, Siddhartha realizes that time is an illusion and that all of his feelings and experiences, even those of suffering, are part of a great and ultimately jubilant fellowship of all things connected in the cyclical unity of nature. After Siddhartha's moment of illumination, Vasudeva claims that his work is done and he must depart in the woods, leaving Siddhartha peacefully fulfilled and alone once more. Toward the end of his life, Govinda hears about an enlightened ferryman and travels to Siddhartha, not initially recognizing him as his old childhood friend. Govinda asks the now elderly Siddhartha to relate his wisdom, and Siddhartha replies that for every true statement there is an opposite one that is also true. That language and the confines of time led people to adhere to one fixed belief that does not account for the fullness of the truth. Because nature works in a self-sustaining cycle, every entity carries in it the potential for its opposite, and so the world must always be considered complete. Siddhartha simply urges people to identify and love the world in its completeness. Siddhartha then requests that Govinda kiss his forehead, and, when he does, Govinda experiences the visions of timelessness that Siddhartha himself saw with Vasudeva by the river. Govinda bows to his wise friend, and Siddhartha smiles radiantly, having found enlightenment. Characters: Siddhartha, the protagonist. Govinda, a friend and follower of Gautama. Siddhartha, a unregistered trademark as father, a Brahmin who was unable to satisfy Siddhartha's quest for enlightenment. The Samanas, traveling ascetics who tell Siddhartha that deprivation leads to enlightenment. Gotama, a spiritual leader Buddha, whose teachings are rejected but whose power of self-experience and self-wisdom is completely praised by Siddhartha. Kamala, a courtesan and Siddhartha's sensual mentor, mother of his child, young Siddhartha. Dies of a snake bite while on a pilgrimage to see the Buddha before she dies, leaving young Siddhartha with Siddhartha and Vasudeva. Kamaswami, a merchant who instructs Siddhartha on business. Vasudeva, an enlightened ferryman and spiritual guide of Siddhartha. Young Siddhartha, son of Siddhartha and Kamala. Lives with Siddhartha for a time but runs away. Major themes: in Hesse unregistered trademark as novel, experience, the totality of conscious events of a human life, is shown as the best way to approach understanding of reality and attain enlightenment. Hesse unregistered trademark s crafting of Siddhartha unregistered trademark s journey shows that understanding is attained not through intellectual methods, nor through immersing oneself in the carnal pleasures of the world and the accompanying pain of samsara. However, it is the completeness of these experiences that allows Siddhartha to attain understanding. Thus, the individual events are meaningless when considered by themselves. Siddhartha unregistered trademark s stay with the Samanas and his immersion in the worlds of love and business do not lead to nirvana, yet they cannot be considered distractions, for every action and event gives Siddhartha experience, which leads to understanding. A major preoccupation of Hesse in writing Siddhartha was to cure his sickness with life by immersing himself in Indian philosophy such as that expounded in the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita. The reason the second half of the book took so long to write was that Hesse had not experienced the transcendental state of unity to which Siddhartha aspires. In an attempt to do so, Hesse lived as a virtual semi-recluse and became totally immersed in the sacred teachings of both Hindu and Buddhist scriptures. His intention was to attain to that completeness which, in the novel, is the Buddha's badge of distinction. The novel is structured on three of the traditional stages of life for Hindu males: householder and recluse renunciate, as well as the Buddha's Four Noble Truths and Eightfold Path, which form 12 chapters, the number in the novel. Ralph Friedman mentions how Hesse commented in a letter, "My Siddhartha does not, in the end, learn true wisdom from any teacher, but from a river that roars in a funny way and from a kindly old fool who always smiles and is secretly a saint." In a lecture about Siddhartha, Hesse claimed Buddha's way to salvation has often been criticized and doubted, because it is thought to be wholly grounded in cognition. True, but it's not just intellectual cognition, not just learning and knowing, but spiritual experience that can be earned only through strict discipline and a selfless life. Friedman also points out how Siddhartha described Hesse's interior dialectic: all of the contrasting poles of his life were sharply etched, the restless departures and the search for stillness at home. The diversity of experience and the harmony of a unifying spirit. The security of religious dogma and the anxiety of freedom. Aberard Osterman has shown how Hesse, while mixing the religious genre of the legend with that of the modern novel, seeks to reconcile with the double-edged effects of modernization such as individualization, pluralism or self-disciplining. Film versions: a film version entitled Siddhartha was released in 1972. It starred Shashi Kapoor and was directed by Conrad Rooks. In 1971, a surrealistic adaptation as a musical western was released as Zachariah. John Rubinstein starred in the title role and George Englund was the director. Don Johnson played Matthew, the equivalent of Govinda. English translations. In recent years several American publishers have commissioned new translations of the novel, which had previously been impossible because of copyright restrictions. In addition to these newer translations, Hilda Rossner's original 1951 translation is still being sold in a number of reprint editions put out by various publishers. The newest translations include Rupa & Co., a translation by Hilda Rossner. Modern Library, a translation by Susan Banofsky, foreword by Tom Robbins, translator's preface. Penguin, a translation by Joachim Neugrüschel, introduction by Ralph Friedman, translator's note. Barnes & Noble, a translation by Rika Lesser, introduction by Robert A. Thurman. Shambhala Classics, a translation by Sharab Kar Paragraph Zine Cohn, introduction by Paul W. Morris, translator's preface. Translations into Indian languages. The Hermann Hesse Society of India has initiated a project to prepare authentic translations of Hermann Hesse unregistered trademark Siddhartha into all Indian languages. HHSI is a non-profit organisation established in 2005 under Government of India Act XXI of 1860 at Tellicherry, the birthplace of Hesse unregistered trademark S mother, a small town, which in many ways was responsible for attracting Hermann Hesse to Eastern thought and culture. Tellicherry is also a place where Hesse unregistered trademark S grandfather, the scholar Hermann Gundert lived and worked during most of his productive life. HHSI had its genesis in the Hermann Hesse Translation Project initiated by the Centre for South Indian Studies in 1991. The main objectives of the Hermann Hesse Society of India are, to promote an India studies on Hermann Hesse unregistered trademark S works, which have created international understanding and enhanced intercultural dialogue to an extraordinary degree, and to encourage translation and publication of Hermann Hesse unregistered trademark S works in Indian languages. HHSI project also include an Indian translation in English by a team consisting of members who translated the work into different languages including Sanskrit. An advisory-cum-editorial board coordinates the translation of Hesse unregistered trademark S works into Indian languages. Already translations in Sanskrit, Hindi and Malayalam have been completed. Translations in Kannada, Tamil and Telugu are under preparation. Cultural references, musical references. The 1972 Yes song Close to the Edge from the Close to the Edge album was inspired by the book. Nick Drake wrote the song River Man, and is the second listed song from Nick Drake's 1969 album 5 Leaves Left, remastered and released as a single in 2004. According to Drake's manager, Joe Boyd, Drake thought of the song as the centerpiece of the album. Jerry Cantrell has a song called Siddhartha on his Degradation Trip double album. Andrew McMahon of the band Something Corporate and Jax Mannequin has the quote "The river is everywhere" tattooed on his wrist and is currently working on a clothing line called River Apparel. The Hot Water Music song Sunday Suit contains the line Siddhartha style, I'll choose a path of open minds. Pete Townshend's song The Ferryman was written for a modern production of Siddhartha in June 1976. The Slovenian rock band Siddhartha was named after the novel. The Sons of Champlin wrote a song entitled Swim, which was inspired by the novel. 10 Mile Tide wrote a song entitled Siddhartha, which provides a musical version of the novel. Ralph McTell wrote the song The Ferryman also based on the novel for his 1971 album You Well-Meaning Brought Me Here. Atmosphere's Sad Clown Bad Dub 2 album contains a song entitled The River, believed by some to inspired by the novel. The Canadian composer Claude Vivier wrote a piece in 1976 for large orchestra called Siddhartha which was inspired by the book. The song All This Time by Sting includes references to Siddhartha. Inspired by the novel, Swedish singer-songwriter J.C. Sh1/4 wrote the song Don't Fight the Flow in 2012 for his fifth album Love This World, an album full of references to Buddhism. Other cultural references, Fred Meyer published the photographic essay Homage to Hermann Hesse and his Siddhartha, which is based on Hesse's novel. In Parks and Recreation, Chris Traeger, a speed reader, said, "One time I read all of Siddhartha at a traffic stop." In Season 1 of Veronica Mars, Episode 19, movie star Aaron Eccles is seen reading Siddhartha on the couch while his two children, Trina and Logan, speak with him. References. External links, full texts of Siddhartha in original German and English translation from Project Gutenberg, audio recording in English of Siddhartha from LibriVox.org, read online Siddhartha from LibriPass.com.